Have you ever noticed how humanity clings to the illusion of progress while silently burying its own soul? We boast about intelligence, inventions, and power, yet history drips with the blood of those sacrificed for ambition. They told us knowledge would save us, that wealth would protect us, that power would bring peace. But what if the opposite is true? What if the very things we worship are the tools of our own destruction? Strange, isn't it? The same hands that build can also kill. The same voices that promise hope can condemn generations. And still, we pretend we don't see. We turn away from hunger, from lies, from war, whispering that it's someone else's fault. But deep down, you know the truth. The line between innocence and guilt is thinner than we want to admit. What you're about to hear is not a story of redemption. It's a story of judgment, a mirror reflecting what we'd rather ignore. It will make you uncomfortable. It may even make you angry. But that's the point, because sometimes the only way to see clearly is to look directly into the darkness we've created. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So, before we begin, I'll ask you for something simple. If this story touches you, unsettles you, or makes you reflect, leave us a small free tip. Like this video, subscribe, and comment your thoughts. It costs nothing, but it means everything to keep these stories alive. Now, take a deep breath. The reckoning begins. There was a heavy silence in that room, as if the air itself had stopped to listen to what was about to be said. He sat before a simple table, his heart beating faster than ever. In front of him, someone who seemed to know every secret, every hidden shadow, every unconfessed gesture. It was an inevitable encounter, postponed for years, but now there was nowhere left to run. It felt like standing before a mirror that showed not just a face, but the entire soul. The voice across from him wasn't loud, yet it carried a weight impossible to ignore. It wasn't a cold question. It was a firm invitation. Sit here close to me. Let's talk. It wasn't a command, almost a whisper that brought both comfort and fear. He realized this wasn't an ordinary judgment, but something greater, something no one escapes. It was as if his entire past had been compressed into that instant, ready to unfold. He took a deep breath, but the air felt dense. The words echoed in his mind. Courage. Look into the eyes, face it. It wasn't about defending himself or explaining. It was about admitting, about stripping away the masks he had worn all his life. And as he thought, flashes of his story appeared like burned photographs, reminding him of choices he wanted to forget. It was the kind of moment when even the proudest feels his legs tremble. The table between them seemed far too small to hold so many truths. There was an almost physical tension, a weight on his shoulders, as if every lie told in the past now sat there silent, demanding to be acknowledged. There was no prosecutor, no lawyer, no jury, only him and that presence that knew everything, a presence that needed no evidence, because the evidence was already within him. And yet, there was something different about that scene. As much as judgment was present, there was also a trace of compassion, as if the story wasn't entirely written, as if there could still be a breath of change. He didn't know for sure, but he felt that this encounter wasn't only about condemnation. It was also an invitation to understand what had truly brought him there, and maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something unexpected. He remembered the words echoing in his head, the kind that had once been whispered to him in childhood, yet he had buried them under years of noise. Do not kill. Do not steal. Simple phrases, so simple that people laugh at them today. But they carry the weight of the world. And there he was, face to face with the undeniable truth. He had broken them. The people he betrayed, the lives he had ruined. They weren't shadows anymore. They had names, faces, and voices that screamed in his silence. There was no need for an accuser. His own memory became the loudest voice in the room. He could still see the hungry child he ignored on the street corner, his little hands trembling in the cold. He could still remember the widow he cheated, the neighbor he defamed, and the man who lost his job because of his lies. Every time he thought he had won, he realized he had only built walls of regret around his own soul. The irony was bitter. He once told himself he was clever, resourceful, even justified. Everyone does it, he whispered his conscience whenever guilt knocked on the door. But sitting here, none of those excuses held weight. They were like smoke, impossible to grab, impossible to lean on. The truth stood taller than his cleverness, heavier than his excuses, and sharper than the blade he once turned against others. In that moment, he realized how strange the human heart is. We fight to hide our failures, but the more we cover them, the louder they echo when we're finally confronted. He thought of the lies he told under oath, of the friend whose trust he crushed, of the opportunities he had to help but chose to ignore. It was as if every no he had said to compassion now returned as a scream. And yet, the weight of it all was not just about punishment. It was about clarity. For the first time, stripped of every defense, he saw the true cost of his actions. Not numbers, not possessions, but people, broken people who once believed in him. And that realization was perhaps the sharpest knife of all, because it hinted that the reckoning had only begun, and there was much more waiting to surface. His mind wandered to the gift he once carried, intelligence. People admired his quick mind, his ability to solve problems that others couldn't. He had the kind of talent that could build bridges, cure diseases, or lift others out of despair. But instead of using it to heal, he used it to harm. He realized now that every invention, every brilliant idea twisted for greed, had become another nail in his coffin. He could still see the laboratories, the endless hours with books and machines. At first, there was passion, the thrill of discovery. But slowly, the purpose shifted. It wasn't about saving lives anymore. It was about profit, about power. He remembered when his colleagues proposed ways to use their knowledge for good, and he was the one who pushed for shortcuts, for weapons, for deals that left destruction in their wake. The irony stung like fire. He once thought knowledge was his shield, a crown that made him untouchable. But sitting there, stripped of his illusions, he saw that knowledge without compassion is a loaded gun in the wrong hands. He could hear the echo of his father's voice telling him, "Your mind is a gift, son. Don't let it blind you." He had laughed then. He wasn't laughing now. Images of the world he helped destroy flooded in. Cities reduced to rubble. Families torn apart. Children with eyes that had already seen too much. None of it had to happen, but his choices fanned the flames. He thought intelligence gave him control, but in truth, it chained him. Every blueprint signed, every weapon designed, became another thread in the web that trapped him here. And in that silence, a question burned brighter than any accusation. What is a man worth if he has the power to save but chooses to destroy? It wasn't a question for the world. It was for him, and him alone. Because deep inside, he knew the story wasn't finished, and the darkest chapters were still waiting to be read. Designed the first plane, his heart whispered of peace. Carrying food to the hungry, medicine to the sick, families across oceans to reunite. But as he sat there now, he realized his dream had been hijacked by darker hands, and he had let it happen. The wings meant for hope had become claws of destruction, tearing through cities like paper. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a monster he had helped to build. The faces of those touched by his work haunted him like ghosts. He saw children staring at the sky in terror, mothers clutching their babies as shadows passed overhead, villages swallowed by fire that rained from planes bearing his designs. He had told himself it wasn't his fault, that he only built the tools. But now, stripped of excuses, he knew better. The tools had names, and so did the victims, and his fingerprint were on them all. He remembered the first time he saw a bomb fall from one of his planes. He had been in a command room far away, watching on a screen, drinking coffee as if it were a movie. At that moment, a part of him tried to scream, but he silenced it with pride. "We're making history," he told himself. Now that memory burned like acid. History wasn't glory, it was blood, and he had helped pour it. Even nature bore his signature. Landscapes once alive with green and songbirds now lay in ruin. Craters where playgrounds once stood, rivers poisoned with smoke. He could still smell the oil, the metal, the heat of engines that turned hope into ash. He had created a weapon so powerful it destroyed not only lives, but the innocence of an entire generation. It was a stain no apology could wash away. And as the weight of it all pressed on his chest, he realized something even darker. He had become a stranger to himself. The man who dreamed of peace had vanished, replaced by a shadow chasing profit, power, and recognition. Sitting here now, there was no applause, no headlines, only the echo of his own choices, louder than any siren, whispering that the reckoning wasn't over yet. Now there was no escape. The trial wasn't happening in a courtroom, but inside his very soul. He could hear the words spoken with a clarity that pierced deeper than any judge's hammer. Guilty or innocent. And in that echo, he already knew the answer, even before it was declared. The man he had become wasn't someone he could offend anymore. He was stripped bare, exposed not by enemies, but by the truth itself. His crimes weren't numbers on a page. They were living screams that refused to fade. The weight of greed pressed like chains around his chest. He had once believed money could shield him from accountability, that gold had the power to silence conscience. But sitting there, he realized every coin he clutched was soaked in blood. His wealth had not bought him freedom. It had only deepened his prison. He remembered signing contracts with shaking hands, convincing himself it was just business, while knowing deep down that he was selling more than goods. He was selling souls. He thought about the people he stepped on to climb higher. Each promise broken, each life manipulated, returned now like an army of ghosts, staring into him with hollow eyes. They weren't strangers. Some were friends, partners, even family who once trusted him. He had built his empire on bones, and now those bones rattled loudly in the silence, demanding to be heard. No courtroom jury could be harsher than their collective gaze. His reflection mocked him. He once called himself a man of power, but what kind of man trades eternity for coins that rust, for treasures that vanish with a gust of wind? He realized that his arrogance had made him smaller, not greater. Like a grain of sand before the ocean, his achievements meant nothing. He had been chasing shadows, while the light slipped further away. The irony was merciless. He owned everything, yet he owned nothing at all. And there, in the crushing silence, came the most terrifying thought. If money couldn't buy forgiveness and power couldn't erase guilt, what was left for him now? The question lingered, heavier than any verdict, leading him to the next unspoken chapter of his downfall. The silence around him felt like a battlefield after the last bomb had fallen. Smoke hanging in the air, ashes clinging to the wind, the faint stench of blood lingering as if the earth itself had been wounded. He could almost see the ruins of cities he never visited, yet destroyed with his choices. Each broken wall, each abandoned street, seemed to carry his name carved into the stone. It was as if history itself had turned into a graveyard, and he was the only living witness left to walk among the tombs. The cries of the innocent rang louder in his ears now, not as whispers, but as screams tearing through the darkness. He could see mothers holding lifeless children, fathers digging graves with bare hands, entire generations erased in moments of fire and smoke. And though he had not pulled the trigger himself, every scream clung to his soul like shackles. His conscience painted the ground red, reminding him that silence in the face of evil is the loudest crime of all. Shadows seemed to surround him, pressing closer, like faceless figures born from his guilt. They had no eyes, no mouths, yet their presence was suffocating. Each shadow was a memory. A man betrayed, a child starved, a neighbor slandered. They circled him endlessly, a storm of accusations too heavy to outrun. He wanted to close his eyes, but the darkness inside was worse than what he saw outside. There was no escape. The jury was everywhere. Even the heavens above appeared fractured in his mind, split open with thunder and fire. He imagined the sky bleeding red, stars falling like burning tears, and the world collapsing beneath the weight of his greed. The visions weren't illusions. They were truths he had buried, now risen like corpses refusing to stay in the ground. It was apocalypse in miniature, a personal end of days designed only for him. And he knew this destruction wasn't written by fate. It was written by his own hands. And as the visions consumed him, one realization struck harder than all the rest. This wasn't just about what he had done to others, but about what he had done to himself. He had murdered his own innocence, bombed his own soul, starved the very humanity within him. He wasn't a victim of darkness. He was its architect. And in the silence after the screams, the ruins stood as monuments of his choices, whispering that the reckoning was far from over. He lowered his head, and for the first time truly felt the weight of being small. All the towers he had built, the deals he had signed, the empires he claimed to control, none of them could shield him now. In that silence, he wasn't the man who once commanded rooms. He was just a fragile body, trembling under the truth. His pride had made him believe he was untouchable, but here he was, shivering like a child in the cold. The might of his name vanished, leaving only the echo of mistakes. He thought about the nights he lay in silk sheets, convinced he had conquered life. The world outside could starve, but he told himself he deserved comfort. Now, when he closed his eyes, the sheets felt like funeral shrouds, wrapping him tighter with every breath. He remembered the faces of workers he underpaid, the families who suffered so he could eat delicacies, the laughter he ignored because profit was louder. Each indulgence now tasted like ash in his mouth. The more he reflected, the more he saw his wealth as a curse. He had thought gold would silence judgment, but it had only amplified it. Coins clattered like chains in his memory. Contracts burned like torches lighting his shame. He realized his fortune wasn't freedom. It was a coffin lined with velvet, beautiful on the outside but suffocating within. Every possession, every mansion, felt like another brick sealing him in darkness. His thoughts drifted to faith, not the kind spoken in churches, but the quiet belief that some things are sacred. He had stepped on those sacred things, dismissing them as superstition. Now, stripped of excuses, he longed for even the smallest spark of that faith. A child's prayer, a mother's whispered blessing, even a candle in the dark. They would have been enough to remind him that life was more than profit. But he had mocked those voices, and now they were gone. And yet, in the deepest corner of his guilt, a fragile question flickered. Was redemption possible even here? The shadows didn't answer. The ruins stayed silent, but the thought refused to die. It was a thread thinner than a hair, and still, he clung to it, afraid that letting go would mean drowning completely. He didn't know if it was hope or just another illusion, but it was enough to pull him toward the next revelation waiting in the dark. The room around him felt like a courtroom carved from shadows, where every wall was a mirror reflecting pieces of his broken soul. He couldn't escape his own eyes staring back, accusing him silently with every glance. The verdict had not yet been spoken, but he already knew where it leaned. He wasn't standing before strangers. He was standing before the truth, stripped of illusions, stripped of excuses. And truth is always a harsher judge than any man could be. He remembered mocking others who lived by principles, calling them naive, calling them weak. Yet here he was, powerless, brought down not by enemies but by the weight of his own choices. His tongue had lied with ease, his hands had signed destruction, and his silence had killed as surely as any weapon. Every law he once dismissed now rose like a mountain before him, immovable and eternal. He wasn't above it anymore. He was crushed beneath it. The words came back, burning in his ears like fire. You can't buy me. Money, which once seemed like a god, now lay useless, scattered like dust at his feet. He had bribed, bargained, manipulated, and bought his way out of every corner, except this one. Here, there was no deal to make, no contract to twist. The judge before him wanted no gold, only the truth. And truth was the one currency he had spent recklessly until he had none left. The more he thought, the more monstrous he felt. He wasn't the hero of his own story. He was a villain hiding behind luxury and applause. His reflection revealed not a man, but a shadow devouring itself, a beast disguised in fine clothes. He thought of the scriptures he mocked, the commandments he trampled, and now each one rose like an iron chain around his neck. He had not simply broken rules. He had broken himself. And as the silence deepened, he realized the judgment wasn't about punishment alone. It was about revelation. This was the stripping away of masks, the unveiling of what he had always been, but never admitted. He had thought himself powerful, untouchable, even immortal. But here, he was nothing more than dust before the wind, waiting for the next breath of truth to blow it all away. The truth stood taller than him, towering like a mountain he could never climb. For every sin he tried to excuse, another memory rose to crush him. He realized there was no escape, no loophole, no clever argument that could soften what he had done. The walls seemed to close in, whispering his crimes back to him, each syllable heavier than iron. He wasn't being judged anymore. He was being unmasked, and there was no dignity left to hide behind. He thought of the day he laughed at the suffering of others, convincing himself it was just survival, just the way the world worked. Now those laughs echoed like screams in his skull. His arrogance had once convinced him he was above consequence, but now he felt like an insect crawling before a storm. The irony was cruel. He had spent his life acting like a giant, but in truth, he had always been small. Smaller than the smallest grain of dust caught in eternity's gaze. The air grew heavy, and his own heartbeat sounded like drums of war inside his chest. He saw again the ruins, the graves, the endless trail of lives scarred by his choices. But this time, he saw himself standing in the middle of them, not as an observer but as the cause. Blood clung to his hands and visions so vivid, he could almost feel the warmth of it. Every step he had taken in greed was now stained red, and no water on earth could wash it away. There was no one to plead with, no jury to sway, no mercy to beg for. The figure before him wasn't swayed by tears or bargains. It demanded only truth, and truth left him naked, trembling, and broken. He realized then that this was worse than death. This was exposure. Death takes the body, but truth strips the soul, leaving it raw and bleeding for all eternity. He wished for an end, but endings are mercy, and mercy was denied. And as the silence grew unbearable, he finally understood the horror. This was not a punishment handed down by another. This was punishment he had written for himself. With every lie, every betrayal, every moment he chose power over compassion. There was no final chance, no secret escape route. Only the abyss remained. And the abyss was already swallowing him whole, preparing him for the last and darkest revelation yet to come. The ground beneath him trembled, as if the earth itself rejected his presence. He saw the world not as it was, but as it had become, burned, poisoned, scarred beyond recognition. Oceans boiled black, skies wept fire, and forests that once sang with life now stood as skeletons of ash. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a reflection of humanity's greed, of his greed. And the worst truth of all was that it wasn't fate that carved his ruin. It was choice. All around, rivers of blood seemed to flow, carrying the cries of generations silenced before their time. Children's laughter, one a melody of innocence, echoed back as hollow wails of hunger and despair. He saw faces, endless faces, not strangers of humanity itself. People he had ignored, betrayed, trampled underfoot in the name of progress. The horror was not just in what was destroyed, but in how casually it had been done. Lives traded for gold. Peace exchanged for fire. He wanted to look away, but the visions forced his eyes open. Cities lay in ruin. Skyscrapers bent like broken ribs jutting from the earth. Graveyards stretching further than the horizon. And in the smoke, he saw humanity's reflection. Not heroes, not dreamers, but executioners of their own kind. The bombs, the lies, the greed, they weren't tools of survival. They were weapons of suicide, and he had carried them proudly. The shame scorched his soul like a brand. The figure before him spoke no words now, because none were needed. The silence screamed louder than thunder. He was called man, yet he was the worst of animals, not driven by instinct but by arrogance. He thought intelligence was salvation, but it had become the sharpest blade. Every commandment he mocked, every law of love he trampled, rose now as fire around him, and he understood there was no redemption, only eternal witness to the devastation he helped create. And so he stood there, stripped, condemned, swallowed by the abyss of his own making. No escape, no forgiveness, no light waiting at the end of the tunnel. Just the endless weight of guilt, pressing, suffocating, eternal. The punishment wasn't flames or chains. It was memory, inescapable and merciless. And in that darkness, he finally understood the true horror. Humanity had destroyed itself, and he was not the exception. He was the proof that man, left his own desires, will always build his own hell. And now, as the echoes of the story still hang in the air, I wanted to pause for a moment and imagine something. Imagine the gaze of God, not the gaze of a stranger, not the judgment of men, but the eyes that see through everything, eyes that pierce the masks, that see what we hide even from ourselves. What would he see in you? In us? Would he see compassion or betrayal? Would he see love or selfishness? The truth is uncomfortable. He doesn't measure us by what we own or by the titles we wear. He measures us by the way we treat one another. Every lie, every betrayal, every act of indifference, they don't disappear. They echo, and one day they stand before us just as they stood before him in this story. You can't bribe him. You can't bargain with him. You can only face the reflection of who you truly are. So I ask you, how does this story make you feel? Do you see parts of yourself in it? Do you see parts of humanity that scare you? Leave your answer in the comments, because your reflection might be the spark someone else needs to confront their own truth. And more than that, tell us, what song should we transform into the next story? Which words do you want to see turn into a mirror, revealing what hides behind the verses? If this story moved you, if it disturbed you, if it opened your eyes even a little, don't walk away in silence. Subscribe to the channel, activate the notifications, and join us in hearing stories that will never let you look at music the same way again. Because here, every lyric hides a truth, and every truth demands to be faced.